Hey guys, tonight we step right into the drowsy fields and rolling hills of ancient Greece, where the air smells faintly of wild thyme, and the lazy drone of bees is practically nature's white noise machine. You can imagine yourself lying back on scratchy grass, sandals kicked off, gazing up at a sky that refuses to be rushed. Somewhere off to the side, you spot Dionysus, the god who is never quite serious and never quite sober, already up to something peculiar with those bees. And trust me, if you think this is going to be glamorous, it isn't. You probably won't survive this if you expect non-stop adventure, because what we're doing is snooping into the slow, sticky world of honey and wine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like sharing, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk into a small village square, its dusty stones warmed by a day's sun. Bees drift lazily between clay pots filled with crushed grapes and clay jars dripping with honeycomb. People glance up, yawning, as they watch Dionysus lounging under a fig tree, a half smile on his lips, like he knows a joke he'll never bother to explain. He gestures to the bees as if they're his personal choir, buzzing at just the right pitch. The funny thing is, bees in Greek myth aren't background extras. They're practically side characters with their own scripts. They appear when gods are born, when temples hum with sacred sound, and when offerings need a golden touch. One mainstream fact is that bees were so tied to divinity that priestesses at Delphi were sometimes nicknamed the Delphic bees. It's not just poetic, it's a reminder of how important the buzzing was to the sacred atmosphere. Imagine going to get your prophecy and hearing in the background what sounds like someone left the world's biggest beehive running. Now, Dionysus himself is already complicated. He's the god of wine, yes, but also of theatre, frenzy, rebirth, and the occasional awkward goat costume. Tonight, though, you catch him teaching bees something that seems at once too practical and too absurd: how to make honey wine. Mead, as we'd later call it, existed across cultures long before the Greeks made it fashionable or divine. People discovered that if you let honey sit around too long in water, it ferments, and suddenly you've got yourself a slightly fizzy, golden drink that's less medicine and more, oops, I'm singing loudly at strangers. The quirky tidbit here is that some myths claim Dionysus didn't just stumble upon grapes. He also meddled in other ferments. There are whispers of him teaching mortals how to brew honey into drink, almost as if he wanted to broaden the menu before the vineyard industry fully kicked off. It makes sense in a cheeky way. You can't expect a god of excess to stick with one beverage forever. As you sit with this thought, a bee lands on your arm. You notice how heavy it looks with pollen, as if it's been running errands all day. Bees in myth often symbolize industry and community, but under Dionysus's gaze, they seem to lean more toward chaos disguised as order. Historians still argue whether Dionysus was ever truly linked to beekeeping traditions, or if later storytellers just stuffed bees into his myths like raisins into a fruitcake, because it made the narrative sweeter and slightly more ridiculous. You shuffle closer to the fig tree. Dionysus raises a clay cup, filled with a liquid that smells like both honey and a late-night mistake, and lets a bee hover dangerously close to the rim. The villagers watch, unsure whether to clap or swat. You can almost hear the gods whisper, "See, even bees like a good drink." You're not sure whether to nod politely or question your life choices, but you go along with it. That's the thing about Dionysus. His stories pull you in whether or not you want to join the party. As evening rolls in, the hum of bees blends with the chorus of crickets, and the first stars scatter across the darkening sky. Dionysus leans back, eyes half closed, while the bees form their own constellation in the air. You lie there too, lulled by the rhythm, realizing this is exactly how myths work. They make you slow down, notice the small things, and find wonder in the absurd idea of bees learning to make wine. Somewhere nearby, a villager mutters that honey is the food of the gods, ambrosia's cousin, maybe even its secret ingredient. Another insists that honey is medicine, while a third suggests it's just sugar with good PR. Dionysus doesn't bother correcting anyone. He just chuckles, raises his cup, and lets the bees decide what story to tell. And as your eyes grow heavy, the thought lingers. If bees really did learn winemaking from a god, then every buzz you hear on a summer evening might just be a tiny toast in Dionysus's honor. You wake the next morning still in that Greek hillside, the air cooler, the dew dampening your toes as you trudge through patches of thyme and sage. The bees are already awake, zipping from one purple flower to another, with more energy than any mortal could muster before breakfast. And there he is again, Dionysus, though smaller this time. A boy, a child god, wandering the hills like he belongs to every bramble and brook. You follow along, because that's what you do in myth. You trail behind, a little dazed, wondering what lesson you're about to absorb. Childhood myths of Dionysus are a tangle. He is famously born twice, first from Semele, then reborn from Zeus's thigh after her fiery demise. That alone should tell you he's not the kind of kid who grows up quietly. As a boy, Dionysus is often hidden away, sent to far-off valleys so Hera won't notice another one of Zeus's children traipsing about. You picture him running barefoot, sticky with wild berries, already humming along with bees that seem to recognize him as something more than human. One mainstream historical fact worth savoring is that in many rural parts of Greece, hillside beekeeping wasn't just a hobby, it was survival. Honey was one of the only sweeteners available. It preserved fruits, sweetened bread, and doubled as medicine. So when the myths place young Dionysus in rustic landscapes, surrounded by buzzing bees, it's not just poetic, it's rooted in daily life. People really did depend on those hives, guarding them carefully, like you might guard your last pack of cookies in a crowded dorm. The quirky tidbit. Some myths describe bees as literal nurses to baby gods. In one story, baby Zeus is hidden in a Cretan cave, fed not only goat's milk but honey from sacred bees. If Zeus himself grew up on honey, it feels almost inevitable that Dionysus, his son, would inherit a special buzzing entourage. Imagine a cradle rocked not by lullabies, but by the steady drone of bees. A natural white noise machine, except one that occasionally stings the babysitter. Historians still argue whether Dionysus's association with bees is original to his cult or borrowed from earlier, local traditions. Some say his myths absorbed rural symbols of fertility and sweetness to make him more approachable. Others argue that the bee imagery came later, attached to priestesses and oracles, and retrofitted into Dionysian tales because, frankly, bees make for excellent poetic props. You can picture two scholars in a lecture hall, droning on longer than the bees themselves, one insisting it's authentic, the other rolling their eyes. As you trail the child god through the brush, you notice he doesn't walk so much as meander, like a child who knows he can't get lost because the world bends itself around him. He crouches to watch ants carry crumbs, giggles at a grasshopper's leap, then holds out his finger for a bee to land, calm as if the stinger were never invented. You feel yourself relax just watching. At one point, he plucks a cluster of grapes, already ripe, and smashes them between his palms. The juice trickles, sticky and purple, onto the ground. A bee dives in immediately, wings shimmering in the sun, lapping at the sweetness. Dionysus grins, as though he's just invented the concept of partnership, the boy god and his buzzing friends sharing snacks. Villagers pass by occasionally, whispering that this odd child seems too comfortable with creatures that most people avoid. They shake their heads, muttering about omens. You get the sense that even as a boy, Dionysus is blurring boundaries between human and divine, between wild and tame, between what you should fear and what you might just befriend. The hum of bees grows louder as the day warms, until it feels like the very air is vibrating. You try to focus, but it's almost hypnotic, like someone tuned the background noise of the universe to nap mode. Dionysus lies back on the hillside, eyes half shut, hands sticky with grape juice, and the bees hover around him, forming a kind of halo. You realize you're seeing the earliest hints of a god who will forever tie sweetness to ecstasy, honey to intoxication. Your stomach rumbles. Apparently Greek hillside walks don't come with free breakfast. You glance at a villager who's carrying a clay pot filled with thick honey. He dips his finger in, offers it to you, and it's almost painfully sweet. Cloying but irresistible. No sugar packets, no candy bars, just this golden syrup that tastes like the sun itself condensed into edible form. You think of Dionysus as a child, already weaving these flavors into his destiny. The godling rolls over, humming to himself, and whispers something you can almost catch. Sweetness becomes spirit. You're not sure if he's talking about honey turning into mead, Grapes into wine or childhood curiosity into divine myth? Maybe it's all of it. With Dionysus, things rarely come in neat categories. The hillside fades into the steady hum of bees, your eyelids heavy. And as you drift in that liminal space, you realize this child isn't just wandering, he's already teaching, though in the slow, roundabout way only myths can. You're still in that same countryside, the hills rolling lazily around you. But the scene shifts. The boy god has wandered off, and now you're sitting in the square of a tiny village where the people are busy with their most prized sticky treasure. Honey. The air smells sweet, almost too sweet, the kind of sweetness that clings to your throat. Bees drift in and out of rough clay jars, and every so often, a villager shoos one away with a bundle of thyme. Not too harshly, it's more like a polite suggestion than a command. What you notice first is how often jars of honey appear on the altars here. Villagers shuffle toward a small stone shrine, carefully placing offerings, figs, flatbread, and, always, a little vessel of honey. One mainstream historical fact is that honey was among the most common offerings in ancient Greek rituals. Temples received it not just as food for the gods, but as a fragrant libation poured into the ground or over the altar. Sometimes it was mixed with milk or wine, but honey was the reliable star, almost like the divine equivalent of bringing cookies to a potluck. A quirky tidbit that slips into your mind. In certain festivals, Greeks would offer honey to placate the restless dead, pouring it into small pits as if sweetening the underworld itself. Imagine the oddity, believing that Hades' realm might just calm down if you bribed it with dessert. You can picture a villager muttering, "Let's just give them something sticky so they don't bother us tonight." It's equal parts charming and unsettling, like leaving cookies out for Santa but hoping he doesn't haunt your dreams. Historians still argue whether honey offerings were meant primarily for the Olympian gods or whether they were actually more important in chthonic rituals, those linked to the underworld. Some say honey was a pure, unbloody sacrifice, making it the preferred gift for gods of fertility and rebirth. Others claim it was a way to sweeten darker forces, a kind of sugary peace treaty. You stand in the square, listening to two old men bicker about it, each insisting their grandfather told them the real reason. One waves his cane in the air, the other swears loudly by his bees. The debate goes unresolved, like most scholarly arguments, buzzing but never stinging. The scene grows busier. Children run with chunks of honeycomb, gnawing like it's candy. Women smear honey on bread, pressing it into the hands of workers trudging back from the fields. You can almost taste it yourself. Grainy bread, chewy and plain, suddenly transformed by that golden drizzle. No wonder honey was considered close to divine. It turned the dull into the delightful. You follow a young priestess as she carries a shallow bowl of honey toward Dionysus' little shrine. It's a rustic affair, branches twisted into an arch, ivy creeping up the stones, a clay mask of the god hanging in the shade. She places the bowl down, her fingers sticky, and murmurs something you can't quite catch. A bee hovers near, then lands on the rim, sipping carefully, as if it too has the right to partake. And maybe it does, because bees here aren't pests, they're sacred collaborators. You watch one crawl across the honey, then take off again, wings glinting. The villagers don't swat, they smile, as though the bee itself has blessed the offering. The square quiets for a moment, and you feel the odd hush of reverence. You hear someone whisper an old story, that when Dionysus was still young, a band of nymphs once presented him with a jar of honey as a gift. He laughed, poured it into water, and discovered that the bee's golden treasure could transform into something more than sweetness, something spirited, something intoxicating. Whether that's true or not, you can see how these villagers believe it. To them, every jar of honey placed on the altar is a reminder of a god who took sweetness and turned it into celebration. You sit back, imagining what it must have been like to live in a world where honey wasn't just pantry stock, but divine currency. A drizzle here to calm a god, a smear there to heal a wound, a bowl offered to the dead. Honey was everywhere, sticky fingers and sticky myths, binding the whole culture together. As the sun dips lower, the golden light makes the honey glow brighter in its jars, as if it's lit from within. Bees hum around the offerings like tiny priests, carrying the essence of sweetness to wherever the gods might be listening. Dionysus, you sense, is somewhere nearby, smiling at the whole thing, content to let mortals keep pouring, keep guessing, keep buzzing. The village square fades behind you, and you find yourself trudging up a rocky slope dotted with vines that seem to grow a little too enthusiastically. The clusters of grapes are bursting, heavy and purple, dripping juice onto the ground as if they couldn't care less about moderation. And standing among them, naturally, is Dionysus. No longer a child, but not yet the wild god of the theatre masks either. He looks like someone's older cousin who decided to host a party before figuring out what rent is. The air here is different. It's warm and thick, carrying the sharp tang of fermenting fruit. A clay jar has tipped over, and the juice is pooling, buzzing with flies and, of course, bees. You crouch closer, and the smell is unmistakable. It's wine, though rougher, wilder. Nothing like the carefully pressed vintages later Greeks would brag about. It's halfway between juice and chaos. One mainstream historical fact. Before grape wine became the hallmark of Greek civilization, fermented drinks were often rough experiments. People mixed whatever was available, honey, barley, wild grapes, herbs, and let nature take its course. The earliest wines weren't the refined pores of a symposium. They were cloudy, gritty, sometimes sour, sometimes accidentally delicious. Imagine hosting a dinner party and passing around a drink that might either taste divine or like wet socks. You just rolled the dice. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some myths, Dionysus doesn't only gift grapes but also plays around with honey-based brews. Mead, made from honey and water, may have been humanity's first intentional alcohol, predating widespread viticulture. There are tales that shepherds left honeycomb in rainwater, forgot about it, and returned weeks later to find a liquid that made them sing off key. You imagine one of them staggering home, insisting it was part of the plan. Historians still argue whether the Greeks themselves brewed much mead, or whether it was more of a northern import. Some scholars claim Dionysus's honey wine myths reflect foreign influences sneaking into Greek storytelling, while others insist the Greeks experimented with whatever could bubble. It's one of those debates where you picture professors sniffing tiny samples in dusty museums, each insisting they can smell clear evidence of fermentation. You sit on the slope as shepherds wander in, carrying wineskins patched with wax and smelling faintly of sheep. They gather around Dionysus, who's already laughing too loudly, his hair curling with ivy. He shows them how to mash grapes with bare feet, squish, squelch, splash, and then tosses in a lump of honeycomb, just to see what happens. The shepherds stare, hesitant, but then shrug. Why not? The mix ferments in the sun, buzzing with bees that can't resist the sweetness. You can almost hear the argument later. Was it the grapes or the honey that made the drink so intoxicating? Dionysus doesn't care about the details, he cares about the effect. He pours a ladleful into a shepherd's cup, and within minutes the man is swaying, trying to dance with a vine. Another shepherd starts singing loudly about his favourite goat, and the god claps along as if it's the best performance he's ever heard. It's messy, ridiculous, and strangely comforting. You realise you're watching not the polished ritual of symposium drinking, but the early awkward revelries. Half prayer, half party. Nobody here is quoting philosophy. They're laughing at spilled drinks, trying not to trip on their own sandals, and occasionally blaming bees when they fall over. The sun dips lower, turning the fermenting jars into little glowing cauldrons. Dionysus lifts his own cup, sticky with grape juice and honey, and gives you a wink as if to say, "This is how it starts." You sip cautiously. The taste is odd. Sharp grape, floral honey, a little bitterness, but it warms your chest. And suddenly, the crickets sound like a chorus. The bees continue their work, drawn to the rim of every vessel, dipping their tiny tongues into the froth. The shepherds don't swat them away anymore. In fact, one man insists the bees are priests in disguise, blessing the brew. Another claims they're tiny spies for Zeus, here to check on Dionysus's antics. Nobody agrees, but nobody minds. As the night deepens, the group sprawls across the hillside, voices slurred, songs sloppily overlapping. Dionysus leans back, smiling with grape-stained teeth, while the bees hover around him like stars made of sound. And you, drowsy, sticky-fingered, amused, realize you're slipping into the rhythm of it, caught between reverence and ridiculousness, which is exactly where Dionysus wants you. Morning slides in again, though it feels less like sunrise and more like you're waking in the middle of a dream. You wander away from the hillside revelry, still sticky from honey and grape juice, following a faint trail through pine and laurel groves. The air carries a hum, not the loud chaotic buzz of a hive at work, but a softer vibration, like a chorus of tiny instruments warming up. You follow it, curious, and find yourself at the edge of a shaded glade, where Dionysus sits with companions who look less like mortals and more like something in between. The nymphs are there, rustling in leaves, weaving ivy into garlands, their laughter low and playful. They're the ones who have raised Dionysus, taught him to move through forests without snapping twigs, to hear secrets in the murmur of springs. But today, their attention is on the bees. They stretch out their pale arms, letting the insects land on their wrists and shoulders, speaking in whispers you can't quite hear. And then you realize they're not just whispering to each other. They're whispering to the bees. A mainstream historical fact comes to mind. In ancient Greek cult practice, bees were often linked with nymphs and with the idea of secret knowledge. They were seen as carriers of divine messages, bridging the human and divine worlds. That connection carried into how priestesses at certain shrines were nicknamed bees, suggesting that they hummed with wisdom not quite their own. It wasn't just about honey, it was about hidden truths delivered in a drone. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some ancient writers suggested bees could be born spontaneously from animal carcasses, an odd belief called bugonia. Imagine believing that if a dead ox was left in the sun, buzzing bees would emerge from it, like nature's bizarre recycling trick. It's equal parts unsettling and fascinating. And in this glade, you half expect the nymphs to point toward a hollow tree and declare it once belonged to a bear that turned into a hive. Historians still argue whether the association of bees with divine secrets came from observing their orderly hives or from the intoxicating effect of their honey wine. Some scholars argue the symbolism was agricultural, tied to fertility and harvest cycles, while others claim it was mystical, pointing to initiation rites where honey played a role. You stand between the nymphs, watching bees crawl across ivy leaves, and you know neither camp has the full answer. Dionysus is listening too, sprawled against a pine trunk, his curls tangled with leaves. He grins lazily, sipping from a clay cup that you swear was empty a moment ago. The nymphs lean close, murmuring about how bees guard golden mysteries, how their hives mirror the cosmos in miniature, how their dance encodes secrets only a god could read. You lean in, but every time you try to catch the exact words, a bee buzzes too close to your ear and the meaning slips away. Still, you gather fragments. The bees know how to turn sunlight into sweetness. The bees know how to keep a community humming without quarrel. The bees know how to hide treasures in plain sight. Dionysus chuckles as though all of this is obvious. And maybe it is. Obvious to gods, at least. The nymphs suddenly spring into a slow dance, weaving through the clearing, their steps soft and circular. Bees follow in little spirals, as though mirroring the movement. You're reminded of how actual bees dance in their hives to share directions to nectar, something ancient Greeks could never have known in detail, but perhaps they sensed in their myths. It feels like choreography meant to explain a secret world. You sit back, lulled by the rhythm. A bee lands on your finger, its body warm, its hum steady. You try to stay still, as though this moment might grant you a revelation. And maybe it does, that sweetness and chaos often live side by side, and that sometimes the smallest creatures carry the heaviest truths. As dusk settles in the glade, the nymphs release the bees, who rise in a slow golden cloud, drifting toward Dionysus. He raises his cup, lets one hover over the rim, and drinks with the air of someone savoring both the flavor and the secret it carries. You sigh, realizing you've just witnessed another lesson disguised as leisure, that even gods need tutors, and sometimes those tutors have wings and stingers. The glade fades into twilight, and before you know it, you're standing at the mouth of a cavern. It yawns open in the side of a limestone hill, cool air rushing out like the breath of the earth itself. Torches flicker on either side, smoke curling upward, and the hum you heard earlier has grown louder. You step inside, careful on the uneven stones, and realize you're entering not just a cave, but a temple, its walls carved with strange symbols, its ceiling painted with faded colors. And there, tucked against the back wall, are rows of beehives, clay cylinders, hollow logs, even woven baskets, each one thrumming with life. Bees drift lazily through the air, ignoring the torch smoke, as though this place belongs to them as much as to the worshippers. You pause because you don't usually expect a sacred space to smell like warm wax and honeycomb, but here, It makes sense. This is Dionysus's world. Sweet, chaotic, and buzzing with strange energy. One mainstream historical fact: the ancient Greeks really did keep bees in clay hives, some of which survive archaeologically. These hives were often cylindrical, stacked horizontally, and sometimes placed inside sheltered spaces. In Crete especially, archaeological finds suggest beekeeping was widespread, with honey used for both ritual and daily consumption. Standing in this cavern, you can almost feel that continuity, myth layered over everyday practice. Now for the quirky tidbit. There are ancient accounts describing honey dripping directly from cave walls, as if the earth itself produced it. Some places in Greece were said to have honey stones, where sweet liquid oozed out naturally. You imagine worshippers standing in awe, licking the cave walls like kids sneaking icing off a cake. In your cavern, you can almost believe it. The stones glisten faintly, and if you squint, you'd swear droplets are forming. Historians still argue whether sacred beehives inside temples were literal or symbolic. Some claim that actual hives were maintained in sanctuaries, tended by priestesses. Others argue the stories are metaphorical, meant to describe the buzzing sound of worshippers chanting, which was compared to bees. You tilt your head, listening. The hum here really could be either: is it insects? Or is it voices blending into a drone that never quite stops? You can't decide, and maybe you're not meant to. As you walk deeper into the cavern, you notice small altars covered in offerings, bowls of honey, sprigs of ivy, cakes shaped like bees, all lined up neatly. A priestess moves gracefully between them, her hair bound in braids, her robe smelling faintly of smoke and wax. She doesn't startle at your presence. Instead, she gestures for you to come closer. She dips a reed into a jar of honey, touches it lightly to your lips, and murmurs something about sweetness, opening the way to ecstasy. It tastes golden and floral, thick enough to slow your tongue. Dionysus himself is painted on the cavern wall, a faded mural showing him reclining with a cup, bees circling his head like a halo. You can't tell if he looks amused or serious, which is exactly the point. He is both, the god who blesses the feast and the god who unsettles, reminding you that sweetness often masks something deeper. The bees shift suddenly, rising in a swarm that fills the upper chamber like drifting smoke. You duck instinctively, but nobody else seems alarmed. The priestess lifts her arms as if welcoming the cloud, and the hum grows so loud you feel it in your chest. For a moment, you're convinced this is prophecy, not in words, but in vibrations. The kind of message you don't translate but absorb. You back away slowly, the hum still thrumming in your ears. The bees settle again, tucking themselves back into their hives, as if nothing had happened. The priestess smiles faintly, wiping honey from her fingers, and returns to her offerings. You realize that in this temple, bees are not just insects. They are sacred guardians, perhaps even messengers of Dionysus himself. Stepping back out into the night, the stars above look sharper, as if the hum inside the cavern has tuned your senses. The torch smoke lingers on your clothes, and your lips are still sticky with honey. You breathe deeply, realizing you've just walked through a space where the line between myth and daily life blurs completely, where bees buzz not just as creatures, but as keepers of mystery. You trudge onward through a narrow path lined with olive trees, their silvery leaves whispering in the evening breeze. The air is heavy now with the scent of honey, sharper than before, and you realize you're walking toward a village gathering. The glow of firelight flickers in the distance, and soon you stumble into a rustic clearing where earthen jars are being hauled out of storage. The villagers grin, their hands sticky and their clothes dusted with flour and pollen. Tonight is not just about survival, it's about experimenting, which, in ancient Greek terms, means mixing whatever sweet liquid you can find into something that might make you giggle or cough. At the center sits Dionysus, or at least the version of him your sleepy brain conjures. He reclines on a low stool, grapes in one hand, a clay jug in the other, smirking like he knows this scene will go off the rails in the best possible way. The villagers bring out bowls of golden honey, drizzling it into water, stirring with long reeds, and then carefully setting the mixture near the fire to warm. This is no polished winery operation. It's the chaotic birth of mead, and you're invited to sip before it's even properly fermented. A mainstream historical fact drifts into your mind. Honey-based fermentation is one of humanity's oldest brewing techniques. Archaeologists found traces of mead-like beverages in clay pots dating back to around 7000 BCE in China, long before Greece existed as a cultural powerhouse. By the time of the Greeks, honey wine had already travelled across continents, showing up in rituals, feasts, and healing remedies. The quirky tidbit comes bubbling out in the next jar. Some recipes weren't just honey and water. Ancient accounts mention tossing in herbs like thyme or rosemary, or even oddball ingredients like pepper, cheese curds, or bits of bread to encourage fermentation. Imagine someone today handing you a glass of rosemary cheese mead. You'd politely sip once, then claim you suddenly had to feed your neighbour's cat. Historians still argue whether Greeks considered mead the drink of the gods or merely a rustic, early-stage experiment before grapes took over the spotlight. Some claim mead was revered in mystery cults, while others argue it was quickly overshadowed by the booming wine industry, which had better storage, stronger effects, and fewer bees getting stuck in the cups. Either way, in this clearing, you can tell the villagers aren't bothered by academic debates. They just want to toast the night. The first sip hits your tongue, floral and sharp, with a faint medicinal tang. It's not the smooth, refined sweetness of modern honey liquors, but something raw, halfway between tea and moonshine. You feel it burn gently in your throat, and Dionysus laughs softly, raising his own jug as if to say, "See? Told you it works." You're not sure if he means the recipe or the trick of keeping the crowd cheerful. Villagers pass around clay cups, some already tipsy enough to spill half on their tunics. A shepherd plays a flute, off-key but enthusiastic, while a young woman claps along, her palms sticky with honey. A child dips bread into the unfermented mix, making a face when it sticks to his teeth, while an elder sprinkles herbs into a bubbling pot like a wizard adjusting a potion. The whole thing is a beautiful mess, half culinary experiment, half party, fully divine in its own way. The smoke from the fire curls into your hair, and the stars overhead blur slightly. You blink and realize the mead has already loosened the edges of your thoughts. Jokes ripple through the gathering. One man insists bees are secretly drunk themselves, flying zigzag because they've been sipping the ferment. Another woman swears she saw a goat steal a cup once, bleating drunkenly until it collapsed in the grass. You laugh because, honestly, it sounds plausible. A priest from a nearby shrine wanders into the circle, holding a small clay tablet. He chants a short hymn to Dionysus, thanking the bees for their liquid sun, as he calls it. The villagers join in, humming tunelessly but with gusto. The hum sounds familiar, and you realize it echoes the buzzing of bees you heard in the cavern earlier. Maybe this is deliberate. Humans trying to imitate the insect chorus, layering their rituals over natural rhythms. You take another sip, this one sweeter, and the flavors dance differently, more mellow, less sharp. Someone must have perfected the proportions. Dionysus's eyes glitter in the firelight, and for a moment you think he leans toward you, whispering that it doesn't matter whether this is science or magic, fact or myth. What matters is the joy, the little chaos that turns necessity into celebration. The night stretches, cups clink, and songs stumble forward, sometimes in harmony, sometimes hilariously not. You lean back against an olive trunk, sticky fingers resting on your knees, and watch the villagers move like fireflies around the flames. You realize these strange recipes of mead aren't just about drinking. They're about community, about weaving bees and humans and gods into the same sticky web. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you swear you hear bees buzzing again, even though none are here. Or maybe they are, just invisible, carrying the laughter of mortals back to Dionysus's ear. The firelight lingers in your memory, but as you walk onward, the scene shifts. The path widens into a city square, and you suddenly find yourself amid a festival, the kind of event where every stall smells faintly of smoke and sugar, and every passerby looks like they've had just one too many gulps of fermented cheer. Torches sway above your head, carried by dancers who whirl in slow, hypnotic circles. Their shadows leap across the painted walls of surrounding buildings, so exaggerated you almost expect them to step free and join the dance. You hear music, pipes, drums, and the clapping of hands. The rhythm is steady but not hurried, like a heartbeat echoing through the night. People are draped in ivy crowns, and beeswax candles flicker on small altars scattered throughout the crowd. You realize this is not just any feast, it's a Dionysian festival, where the sweetness of honey meets the frenzy of revelry. A mainstream historical fact slides gently into the story. Festivals in honor of Dionysus, like the Anthesteria and the Dionysia, were held across Greece. They celebrated wine, springtime, and the god's unique role as a bridge between order and chaos. These were not simply drunken parties. They were woven into civic and religious calendars, shaping theatre, politics, and even the way cities bonded as communities. But tonight, as you watch, you notice something unusual. Instead of grapes being the main star, bees keep appearing. Wax figurines shaped like bees dangle from vendor stalls. Children run about with small clay cups of diluted honey water. Some dancers even hum deliberately as they circle, their throats vibrating like they're imitating a hive in motion. The quirky tidbit becomes clear. In some fragments of myth and ritual, bees were believed to carry messages from the gods or even fairy souls. So, during certain Dionysian gatherings, their buzzing was imitated to amplify the atmosphere of mystery. Imagine a crowd of half-tipsy Athenians standing around, humming like a swarm of bees, convinced they were tapping into cosmic truths. That's the kind of scene you've stumbled into. Historians still argue whether bees truly had an official place in Dionysian rites, or if they slipped in from neighboring cults, like those of Artemis or the Great Mother. Some insist bees were central to early ecstatic rituals, while others claim later writers simply romanticized their role. As usual, the truth is hazy, sticky, and dripping with possibilities, rather like honey itself. Back in the square, a group of masked performers arrives. Their masks are oversized, painted with wide grins, and their robes shimmer with gold thread. They move through the crowd in a buzzing rhythm, clacking wooden instruments that mimic wings. You feel the hum in your bones, like someone placed a beehive gently against your chest. The performers stop before Dionysus's altar, pouring a mixture of honey and wine over the stones. The scent is overwhelming, sweet, smoky, intoxicating. A joke erupts in your head. You imagine an annoyed bee somewhere shouting, "Excuse me, that was meant for winter storage." But in this moment, the bees are silent, or maybe drowned out by the human attempt at buzzing. The crowd grows louder, the drumming faster. You sway without realizing it, pulled into the rhythm. Someone presses a honey cake into your hand. Dense, sticky, topped with a few sesame seeds. You bite, and it clings to your teeth in that familiar way, just like it did for the child dipping bread back at the village. Only now, the taste is paired with wild music and the torchlit smell of smoke. In a corner of the square, a priestess stands. Her hair is braided with ribbons, her arms painted with spirals. She lifts a small bowl and drizzles honey onto the ground in thin streams, murmuring words you can't quite catch. The crowd quiets for a moment, as if bees themselves have taken command. Then, with sudden intensity, everyone bursts into chant, half singing, half humming, the sound rising like a hive shaken into motion. You glance upward and see actual bees drifting lazily through the torchlight, drawn to the sweetness in the air. Nobody swats them away. In fact, people extend their hands gently, letting them crawl across their skin. The boundary between myth and reality blurs. For a heartbeat, you wonder if the bees themselves are the true celebrants, and humans are merely catching up. The hum grows louder, then steadies, a collective vibration filling the night. Your eyelids feel heavy, not just from the rhythm but from the sheer density of sound and scent. You picture the air thickening into honey, each breath slower, sweeter. Dionysus seems everywhere, his laughter hiding in the flute's squeak, his smirk in the priestess's lips, his promise in the torch flames. And through it all, the bees buzz on, tiny keepers of chaos and order alike. You realize festivals don't just buzz because of music or wine. They buzz because people choose to embody bees themselves, frantic yet purposeful, chaotic yet harmonious. You nibble the last of the honey cake, sticky fingers shining in the firelight, and smile sleepily. If ever there was a night designed to lull you toward drowsy wonder, this was it. The torch smoke drifts behind you as you slip away from the festival square, your ears still echoing with the drone of chanting voices. The sound fades, replaced by the steady trickle of a mountain spring. You follow it upward, toward a stony slope where the air grows thin and sharp. Ahead looms the famous sanctuary of Delphi, perched like an eagle's nest, always waiting to whisper riddles to whoever dares ask. You wander into the outer court, and there she is, the Pythia, seated on her tripod, her face half-shadowed, half illuminated by flickering lamps. You've come to hear her voice. But the strangest thing is the way she's addressed. Priests call her the Delphic bee, a title that sounds both reverent and odd, as if prophecy itself hums like a hive. The mainstream historical fact surfaces smoothly. Several ancient sources, like Plutarch and Pindar, mention priestesses at Delphi being called bees. It was more than a nickname. In Greek thought, bees symbolize purity, harmony, and the mysterious power of nature. Their organized, humming communities seemed an ideal metaphor for divine communication. But as you stand there, listening to the faint vibration of the priestess's voice, you catch the quirky tidbit too. Some ancient writers claimed the first prophetic utterances at Delphi weren't spoken at all, but delivered in a bee-like buzz. Incomprehensible murmurs that only attendants could shape into words. Imagine traveling days through the mountains to ask if you should plant barley this season, only to receive what sounds like an especially annoyed insect chorus. You'd nod politely, pretending you understood, then probably plant barley anyway. Historians still argue whether the whole bee priestess idea was a literal role. Were they actually dressed in bee-like costumes, maybe wearing golden wings? Or whether it was strictly metaphorical, a poetic way of saying the priestesses were conduits of sweet divine nectar. No consensus exists. Some argue it's rooted in older Anatolian traditions where goddesses were linked to bees. Others insist it was purely symbolic. The Pythia shifts, her robes rustling like leaves. Her lips part, and though you can't make out every word, the cadence feels like a swarm. You sense the prophecy more than hear it, vibrating through your chest. It's both unsettling and soothing, like lying in tall grass while a hive hums nearby, knowing you might get stung, but also lulled into a trance. You glance at the walls of the temple, where faint carvings of bees are said to linger, though most visitors overlook them. Priests pass by carrying bowls of honey cakes as offerings, their movements deliberate, their faces calm. You realize that honey is not just food here, it's a bridge. Bees gather sweetness from wildflowers, turn it into something golden, and then deliver it upward to the gods through rituals. A breeze rolls through the sanctuary, and for a moment you imagine the entire temple is a hive. Stone columns as combs, priests as drones, the Pythia as queen, her words nectar turned into prophecy. The metaphor spins tighter the more you think about it. The crowd that gathers around her reacts differently. Some nod solemnly, taking her words as law. Others whisper, confused, unsure whether they just heard approval or doom. You smirk softly, because that's the essence of oracles, ambiguous enough that, no matter the outcome, someone later claims, well, she did warn us. You shuffle closer, and the priestess fixes her gaze on you. Her eyes gleam in the lamplight, unfocused yet piercing. She hums again, a droning syllable that grows into words you almost recognize. Perhaps she tells you bees were Dionysus's messengers, carrying wine's spirit into mortal dreams. Or maybe she's just telling you to wash your hands before dinner. Either way, the effect is hypnotic. The hum stretches longer, wrapping around your skull like a blanket of sound. It's no wonder bees became symbols of divine wisdom. They sound like the world's first ASMR artists. You chuckle softly, then cover your mouth, because laughing during a prophecy seems like bad form. As the session ends, attendants sprinkle honey water across the ground. The smell rises, sticky and floral, coating your lungs in sweetness. You step backward, nearly bumping into a carved column, and feel the whole sanctuary vibrating faintly beneath your sandals, as if the mountain itself buzzes with invisible wings. You descend slowly, the path lit by scattered lanterns. Behind you, Delphi hums on, the voices of priestesses mingling with the imagined drone of bees. You wonder how many travelers left with the same sound still echoing in their ears. Half message, half lullaby, all mystery. The mountain air thins and cools behind you, and soon the hum of Delphi gives way to a different landscape. The stones under your feet flatten into smooth dust, and suddenly the horizon unfolds wide and golden. You are no longer in Greece. You are wandering foreign lands, places whose myths and flavors would someday seep into Greek imagination, like honey dissolving in warm water. Your first stop is Egypt, and the sun strikes hard here, brighter than polished bronze. Along the banks of the Nile, you notice hives stacked in clay tubes, bees drifting lazily over lotus flowers. Egyptians treasured honey as the tears of Ra, the sun god. Every spoonful shimmered with divine origin. You remember hearing that pharaohs were entombed with honey jars sealed tight, some of which still lingered edible thousands of years later. Not that you're about to dip your finger in and taste ancient pharaoh jam, but the thought lingers. A mainstream historical fact hums into place. Honey was central not only in Egypt, but across the Near East. Hittites, Babylonians, and Anatolians brewed honey wine long before the Greeks refined their grape cults. Trade routes carried both jars of sweetness and stories of sacred bees, and myths traveled as easily as goods. By the time Dionysus' stories crystallized, Greece had already absorbed centuries of foreign flavor. The quirky tidbit surfaces in Egypt's love of unusual blends. Some recipes for honey drink were infused with date syrup, spices, and even ground herbs that doubled as medicine. One papyrus mentions honey mixed with crocodile dung as part of a fertility concoction. You blink, deciding firmly that you'll stick to rosemary cheese mead, thank you very much. If Dionysus ever did inspire bees, hopefully he kept the crocodile dung far away. Historians still argue whether Dionysian bee myths were born in Greece or imported from these neighboring regions. Some suggest Anatolia, with its great mother cults, had already linked bees to rebirth and ecstasy centuries earlier. Others argue the Greeks simply borrowed honey wine traditions and spun them into their own theatrical mythologies. The debates buzz on like a hive that never quite settles. You drift onward, the Nile's glitter fading into Anatolia's rugged hills. Here, old shrines to Cybele, the mother goddess, stand weathered and quiet. In her rites, priestesses and worshippers often carried honey, smeared it on altars, and hummed chants like bees. Her symbols overlapped with Artemis, later absorbed into Greek ritual. And through those overlaps you sense how Dionysus might have borrowed wings he never fully owned. Further east, in the Persian heartlands, honey was blended with fermented mare's milk. That image alone makes you wince. Sweet and sour colliding in ways you'd rather not imagine. Still, the logic is clear. Everywhere humans met bees, they experimented, and every culture claimed bees belonged to their own gods. You return to Greece in your mind, thinking how foreign inspirations shaped what villagers believed was homegrown myth. Dionysus, that wandering god of wine and frenzy, was often described as traveling eastward, bringing foreign practices back to Greece. Maybe the bee story was part of that long road trip, picked up in Anatolia, flavored with Egyptian sun, fermented in Greek jars until it became a tale of its own. In a crowded agora back in Athens, you overhear men arguing whether Dionysus learned honey wine's secrets abroad or revealed them himself in a mountain vision. The debate sounds like a typical afternoon. One insists the gods must have invented it. Another rolls his eyes and mutters something about barbarian imports. You smile at the thought. Humans never change. They still argue about whether something is authentically local or just borrowed with style. The sky deepens to dusk as you walk, and the voices of traders float in the breeze, Greek, Egyptian, Anatolian, all mingling like bees in a shared meadow. Jars clink, spices scatter, cloths shimmer in the twilight. You realize Dionysus was less a solitary Greek figure and more a tapestry of influences, stitched together by every place he wandered. Bees followed him not because they belonged to him alone, but because they were universal, tiny, buzzing reminders that sweetness is always communal. And so you walk between stalls of honey cakes and clay jugs, your sandals sticking slightly where honey spilled earlier in the day. The mingled scents of foreign lands cling to you. Lotus, thyme, wildflower, smoke. Dionysus's smile flickers in every merchant's grin, every jar sealed with beeswax. His myth is not just Greek, it is stitched from Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond, buzzing endlessly across borders, just like the bees themselves. You wander deeper into the marketplace of voices, and suddenly it feels as if centuries are stacked on top of one another. The chatter of merchants fades into murmurs of philosophers, scribes, and modern scholars still fussing about the same sticky question. Who really deserves credit for the honey wine gift? Was it Dionysus teaching the bees, or was it the bees teaching him? You drift into a courtyard where scrolls are unrolled, their surfaces cluttered with looping script. A scholar in a soot-stained robe gestures with a reed pen, insisting that Dionysus alone was the divine inventor of mead. He brought grapes, yes, but also honey, he says, punctuating each word as if sealing a deal. Across from him, another scholar snorts and mutters that mead predates Greece by millennia, and claiming it was a Greek god's invention is like saying Poseidon invented rain. Here comes the mainstream historical fact. Greek writers often credited Dionysus with more than wine. Some accounts call him giver of all drink, implying his role extended into beer, honey wine, and any substance that could make mortals wobble. The god was a convenient umbrella under which every intoxicant could gather. But the quirky tidbit lies in how arguments unfolded. One philosopher, according to later retellings, mocked the whole discussion by saying, "If bees are his disciples, then surely flies belong to Zeus." Imagine an academic conference derailed by insect jokes, and you're not far from the truth. You can almost see Dionysus chuckling from the sidelines, enjoying the squabble more than the outcome. Historians still argue whether the myth of Dionysus and the bees was central to his cult, or a marginal story inflated later by curious poets. Some scholars propose the link emerged in rural communities where honey was vital, while others argue urban Athenians invented it to add exotic flavor to plays and festivals. No firm consensus ever stuck, which seems appropriate for a god of ambiguity. The courtyard grows crowded with voices. One insists the symbolism of bees points to immortality. After all, honey never spoils, and bees vanish in winter only to return. Another claims bees simply represented disciplined labor, the opposite of Dionysus's chaos, and that tension made for a compelling myth. Yet another voice insists the whole story was imported, a borrowed costume stitched onto Dionysus like ivy on stone. You lean against a column, sticky scroll parchment pressed against your palm, and feel the buzz of disagreement swirl like an actual hive. The sound isn't unpleasant. It's oddly soothing, like white noise. Maybe that's why these debates never ended. The scholars secretly liked the hum of arguing itself. One man dramatically waves a beeswax tablet and claims that the real secret lies in lost recipes of ambrosial honey wine. Another insists it was metaphor, not beverage, a symbolic way of saying Dionysus taught mortals how to turn suffering into sweetness. You almost applaud because if that isn't classic overthinking, what is? The torches in the courtyard flicker low. You imagine them as droplets of honey, burning slowly, illuminating dusty scrolls that no one has fully deciphered. Every voice overlaps, buzzing like the festival chants you left behind. The debates stretch from antiquity through Renaissance scholars to modern classrooms, never finding closure. And you realize perhaps the myth wasn't meant to be solved. Perhaps it was designed to keep buzzing forever, the way bees never rest, circling endlessly from flower to hive to flower again. Dionysus, you think, must be grinning. While mortals argue, he simply reclines, swirling his cup, unconcerned whether bees taught him or he taught them. To him, the real victory is that people are still talking at all. The courtyard fades. The parchment unrolls into darkness. The voices blur into a soft drone, and you step away with the hum still in your chest, like a secret lullaby of disagreement. The courtyard dissolves into something quieter. You find yourself on a narrow Greek street at dawn, shutters half open, the air tinged with smoke from clay ovens. The debates of scholars are behind you now, replaced by the gentle bustle of ordinary life. This is where honey truly belonged, not only in myth, but in kitchens, shops, and medicine jars. You watch a baker sliding golden loaves from a brick oven. He dips a wooden brush into a bowl of warmed honey and paints the crusts until they glisten like sunlight. Children gather, sniffing, impatient for their share. A woman nearby balances a basket of figs, stopping to drizzle honey on them before offering one to a neighbor. Sweetness here is social glue. Daily Greek life leaned heavily on honey, since refined sugar did not yet exist. Mead may have been occasional, but honey itself was constant, stirred into porridges, mixed with cheese, spread on flatbreads, even diluted into water as a simple drink. Physicians prescribed it as a cure for sore throats, digestive troubles, and even wounds. You glimpse a healer at a stall dipping linen into a honey mixture, pressing it to a soldier's scraped arm. The man barely winces, distracted by the sweetness offered on his tongue. Poets, too, leaned on honey. A bard in the corner strums a lyre and recites verses where words are called honeyed. To speak sweetly was not only metaphorical, it was tangible, a comparison every listener understood. Just as bees could turn wildflowers into nectar, a poet could turn raw speech into music. You notice jars of honey stacked in stalls, sealed with wax, marked with scratch symbols. Each hive had its own subtle flavor depending on the flowers nearby. A shopper tilts her head, choosing between thyme-scented honey from Attica or darker pine honey from the mountains. Even in antiquity, people knew the terroir of bees mattered. Some homes used honey ritually, leaving a drop for ancestors or household gods. You peek into a doorway where a woman pours a spoonful onto the hearth, whispering a prayer. For her, it's not Dionysus, but the family spirits who accept the offering. Yet the act connects. Every spoonful, every drizzle is a tiny ritual, a thread binding daily life to myth. Quirky details surface too. Ancient athletes rubbed themselves with oil and sometimes honey before competition, believing it restored vigor. Lovers exchanged honeyed cakes as tokens of affection. And in wedding feasts, the honeymoon was not only metaphorical. Newlyweds drank honey wine for a month, hoping its sweetness would bless fertility. You pause at the edge of the street where merchants, healers, bakers, and poets mingle, all with honey somewhere in their trade. The hum of bees feels invisible but constant, like an orchestra beneath the city's clamour. What strikes you most is how natural it seemed. Dionysus might have been the patron of wine, yet honey was everywhere, woven seamlessly into both sacred ritual and mundane tasks. The myth of Dionysus and the bees no longer feels like a separate story. It feels like the city itself, humming quietly with sweetness, layered into bread crusts, bandages, poems, and prayers. As you walk, you taste the faint stickiness in the air, a reminder that myths live not only in temples but in kitchens, not only in scholars' debates but in bakers' hands. The streets stretch on, lined with jars, buzzing softly until the scene blurs like honey dissolving into warm milk. The streets of honey merchants soften into twilight as you step further, and suddenly you're standing in a meadow where bees drift lazily through the air, their wings catching the low light. There's something more than sweetness here. You start to sense that the Greeks weren't just interested in honey as food. They saw bees themselves as symbols, layered with meaning, whispering about change and transformation. Dionysus, with his endless cycles of death and rebirth, found a mirror in the hive. Bees vanish in winter, only to reappear in spring, as though resurrected. To the ancient mind, this looked like proof that nature could die, yet pulse back to life again. You kneel in the grass and watch a cluster of bees crawl from a hollow log, and it feels like you're watching miniature versions of Dionysus's own story. Historians still argue whether the Greeks truly believed bees were born spontaneously from dead animals, a bizarre idea called bougonia. Imagine, you leave the carcass of an ox to rot, and out of it bees supposedly emerge. Some ancients swore this was how hives began, a strange belief but one that made sense in a world where transformation was everywhere. To them, life sprouting from death wasn't grotesque, it was hopeful. You pass a carved stele where bees are etched alongside grape clusters. It's as though they shared a sacred role. Grapes became wine, honey became mead. Both turned ordinary harvests into intoxicating magic, alchemy in edible form. The transformation mattered more than the taste. In your hands, you find a thin clay tablet, inscribed with a hymn comparing human souls to bees. They wander, they search, they return to the hive. Poets leaned into that imagery because it made sense. You struggle, you tire, but you always come back to the source. Bees were metaphors for community as well as for death and rebirth. Fringe tidbit surfaces in your memory. Some mystic cults called their initiates bees. The secrecy of the hive reflected the secrecy of their rituals. You picture robed figures whispering oaths, comparing themselves to buzzing insects, hidden yet unified. It's a little strange, maybe even creepy, but undeniably fascinating. Transformation also lived in the honey itself. Raw nectar became something preserved, sweeter, more powerful. Just as Dionysus took grapes and turned them into wine, bees turned flowers into something greater. The act of change became sacred. You lick a drop of honey from your finger, and it feels symbolic now, not just sugary. You walk through the meadow, bees orbiting lazily, and notice how your steps sink into the earth. The hum around you is steady, hypnotic. Dionysus's myth isn't about finality, it's about cycles. Bees embody that truth with every disappearance and return. A shepherd passes, humming, his staff tapping the ground. He tells you quietly that his grandmother used to say, bees carried souls of the departed, buzzing gently as messengers between worlds. You nod, because whether or not it was true, you can feel how comforting it would be. Transformation, rebirth, continuity, these aren't abstract ideas here. They're lived experiences, found in every jar, every swarm, every flower turning into honey. As night folds in, you find yourself breathing slower, lulled by the rhythm of wings and the patient knowledge that nothing is ever fully lost, only changed. The meadow dissolves, but the humming lingers like a reminder that the smallest creatures carry the biggest metaphors. You follow the sound, drowsy, as if drifting into another form yourself. You shuffle onward, and the meadow of buzzing bees gradually gives way to a hillside vineyard. Rows of grapevines stretch out like a green sea, and you realize that something subtle has shifted. The air still smells faintly of honey, but now the sharper tang of fermenting grapes drifts over you. This is where the old story starts to bend, where honey wine, once beloved, begins its slow retreat before the rise of grape wine. At first, mead had been the darling drink of both rustic farmers and refined ritual. You could sweeten it, spice it, even mix it with herbs, but grapes grew everywhere in the Greek landscape. Heavy clusters drooping from vines that didn't require elaborate beekeeping. You can almost hear a farmer grumble. Why chase bees and risk stings when the vines hand you juice by the bucket? Historians still argue whether it was purely practicality or cultural prestige that tipped the scales. Was grape wine simply easier to make in bulk, or did it carry more symbolic weight at the symposium tables of the elite? Either way, mead began to look quaint, an old-fashioned cousin to the sophisticated vintages that philosophers and politicians preferred. You pass a clay amphora painted with scenes of revelers. Not a bee in sight, just dancers, flutes, and endless cups of grape wine. It's a small but telling omission. In the public imagination, Dionysus became increasingly tied to vineyards, not hives. The bees who once buzzed around his myths were slowly pushed to the margins, yet the traces linger. You crouch beside a cracked inscription from a forgotten hillside shrine. The letters mention honey being poured alongside wine as an offering. Even in decline, honey held its sweetness as a ritual partner. Think of it like your grandma's old recipe still appearing at family dinners, even if the new dishes dominate the table. A quirky tidbit surfaces. In some backcountry villages, peasants stubbornly clung to honey-fermented drinks far into the grape wine age. For them, it wasn't just taste. It was tradition, a tether to ancestors who had whispered to bees and left jugs of mead at doorsteps for wandering gods. You picture an old villager, hunched and smiling, insisting that his honey brew could heal ailments better than any fancy vineyard bottle. But the tide was clear. By the time Rome rose, grape wine had become so dominant that honey wine was often relegated to novelty or medicinal use. Mead slid into the shadows, and Dionysus, once imagined as a bee friend, transformed into the lord of vineyards. The hum of hives was drowned out by the clink of wine cups. Still, you notice how myths cling even when the world changes. The story of bees teaching Dionysus or Dionysus teaching bees never fully vanished. People retold it in corners, in songs, in offhand mentions. Bees remained symbolic, even as their literal drink faded. It's like an old lullaby you no longer sing daily, but hum under your breath when no one's listening. You walk between the vines, their leaves rustling softly, and the thought presses in. Everything declines, but rarely disappears. Mead receded, yes, but its echoes are there in folklore, in words for sweetness, in the persistence of bees buzzing through myths. Grapes may have won the commercial war, but honey never lost its quiet magic. The vineyard darkens as night folds in. The stars prick open above you, scattered like drops of spilled nectar. You breathe in, noticing that the grape-scented air still carries a faint sweetness of honey, as though the bees refuse to leave entirely. Their presence is quieter now, but it hums just beneath the surface, and you keep walking, understanding that decline is not the same as disappearance. Just another transformation in a story that never really ends. The vineyard fades, and you find yourself again among gentle meadows. Bees hover lazily, their hum slower now, almost like the world itself is yawning and preparing for sleep. Dionysus is nearby, reclining on a stone bench with a smile that suggests he knows the ending of this story has always been about more than drink. You walk closer, and the bees circle him calmly, no longer frantic swarms, but steady companions. They land on his tunic, they settle on grape leaves, they buzz around your shoulders, and none of it feels alarming. Instead, it feels like you're being welcomed into their world, a hive of myth, memory, and transformation. Historians still argue whether the Greeks ever seriously believed Dionysus taught bees to make honey wine, or if that detail was later embroidery. But when you're here, hearing the hum and tasting the sweetness, you realize the truth isn't the point. The story exists because it soothes, entertains, and ties you to people long gone who also loved imagining gods with sticky fingers and buzzing companions. You reach out to touch a jar of honey resting at his feet. The clay is cool, the lid sealed with wax. He nods as if to say, "Sweetness is always waiting if you just pause to notice it." That's the whole lesson. Not immortality, not cosmic power, just bees turning nectar into something worth savoring. A quirky tidbit lingers in your mind. Some medieval monks, centuries later, still called themselves bees of the Lord. They weren't Greek, they weren't Dionysian, but the metaphor refused to die. You can almost hear the echo, bees humming in cloisters, carrying honey for candles, buzzing through myths far from their homeland. The god stretches, the meadow dims, and you feel the weight of drowsiness press into your bones. The bees' hum becomes slower, steadier, like a lullaby. It's time to settle. And as the hum surrounds you, you sink into the story's last embrace, drifting between sweetness and silence, knowing that myths live on because they hum gently in our sleep. The meadow grows softer now, blurred around the edges, as though even the grass is tired of standing tall. The bees continue their slow circling, not buzzing sharply, but gliding like small lanterns in the dusk. Their sound is steady, low and comforting, the kind of background rhythm that lets your thoughts finally uncoil. Dionysus leans back further on the stone bench, eyes half closed, and he doesn't speak anymore. There's nothing left to explain, no new lesson waiting, just the quiet recognition that the tale has run its course, and you are allowed to rest. The sky is a deepening violet, each star emerging one by one, like bees finding their way home to the hive. You follow them with your eyes for a moment, until even that feels like too much effort, and you let your gaze soften. The air is warm, faintly scented with honey and grape leaves, and it wraps around you like a blanket. Each breath you take is slower now. Each exhale feels longer, like you are releasing more than air, letting go of stray thoughts, the day's noise, even the buzzing details of myth itself. What remains is only rhythm, the hum of bees, the steady pulse of your own heartbeat, the fading echo of a god's smile. You notice how heavy your limbs are, how still you've become, and it feels right. The story has carried you as far as it needs to. You can let the last images dissolve into dream. So allow yourself to drift gently into whatever rest awaits. The bees will keep humming, Dionysus will keep smiling, and you can sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.